Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Cristina Baciu. She is Research Program Manager at Arizona State University, co-founder and co-director at the Arizona Cancer Evolution Center, ACE Scholars Program, and co-founder and co-director of the Cooperation Scholars Program. Her research interests include mentoring in higher education, both undergraduate and graduate students, technology and higher education barriers to student success, such as food and housing insecurity, and other topics, but these are the ones we're going to focus on today. So, Dr. Baciu, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Hi, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me. It's a big pleasure to be here with you today.
So, talking about the work you're doing on e-mentoring, so could you tell us first what kinds of mentoring fall under the rubric of e-mentoring? I mean, what kinds of practices and technologies are we talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So e-mentoring is just a word that people use sometimes to refer to practicing mentoring with the use of various technologies, right? We can also find it under various other names, such as online mentoring, virtual mentoring, telementoring, cyber mentoring, so on and so forth. And basically what it means is just refers to using various computer mediated programs to ensure interactions between, say, usually two people. Traditionally, according to the traditional mentoring definitions, it would be perhaps a more experienced person who interacts with a less experienced person who wants to learn something to advance their goals in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so a mentor really helps support the mentee by providing them with learning, advising, encouraging, and modeling that is often, I think, particularly in the online environment, boundaryless and hopefully egalitarian too. And so with that, there are all kinds of various e-mentoring opportunities these days. So, for example, we could see one-to-one e-mentoring where, two people interact online using various technologies or platforms to build their e-mentoring relationship and nurture it that way. We could also see group e-mentoring opportunities where more people come together to interact, to learn from each other, maybe to create community around some shared interests, and grow their relationship that way. We could see peer e-mentoring where people who belong to a certain group are matched by some characteristics or interests or goals or knowledge to come together and help each other. So those are just a few examples of how that could work.
And of course, you work in academia, and your work seems to be focused mostly on e-mentoring applied to academia, but I would imagine that it applies to a variety of contexts, right? And do you study e-mentoring only in academia or also in those other contexts?
That's an excellent question. I do want to study it more broadly, but I haven't really done any work as of right now outside of academia. But I think one of the really great advantages of e-mentoring is that you can take it and apply it to virtually probably any context, right? We certainly see a lot of it happening in academia or in education, more broadly speaking. It can apply to, say, primary, secondary schools, to high schools, to college students, of course, to graduate students, so on and so forth. But I think it can also be applied, and it is applied, broadly speaking, in the corporate world, where companies use it for all sorts of employee onboarding procedures, maybe, or as part of employee training and professional development opportunities, so on and so forth. I think it can also be used in the nonprofits, right? In healthcare, in literally probably anything that we could think of, any field or industry could use e-mentoring to maybe help their people, broadly speaking, form better connections, build community, and just enable them to learn from each other and grow together.
And how long has e-mentoring been applied to the academic context? I mean, how old are e-mentoring practices within academia?
That's an excellent question. Not that old, actually, because it relies on the use of various technologies, right? So e-mentoring evolved along with various technologies such as internet and email, for example. And so I think e-mentoring started to be used as a tool in higher education, for example, in about the 1990s, where I think the first online courses started to appear. And when that happened, professors used e-mentoring as a tool to kind of make sure that their students are supported and get what they need in order to be able to be successful in their online courses. Then fast forward over the years, in the 2000s, it also continued to evolve, right? But particularly after 2010, 15, again, the more technology developed and the more people in academia, right, the more students got access to online education, and the more universities started to offer various online degrees, then e-mentoring kind of kept up the pace with that growth, and was used more and more by universities and by professors to make sure that the students in these online courses and programs are successful. And even though this happened, and even though e-mentoring definitely grew over the years, right, it's debatable whether or not research really has kept up with that and with really, examining a broad variety of factors that might, say, influence the success of e-mentoring relationships.
So we're going to get into some of the details surrounding this, but does the online environment change how teaching and learning is done and occurs?
Great question. I think it does, right? And I think it does for the better. For quite some time, there was a debate there on whether or not, online learning is a thing that students can engage in successfully. Is it as valuable as a degree one would get in person? Does it carry weight with employers? All these questions were at people's minds for a while, right? And maybe there still are in some contexts, but I think the COVID-19 pandemic has largely influenced how people perceive online learning. And we definitely see now many, many more offerings for online programs and, college degrees, graduate degrees, you name it. Universities probably have it if people are interested in them, right? But to come back to your questions, I think definitely the online context does change or maybe influence a little bit teaching and learning, in the sense that, for example, it provides increased access to education, broadly speaking. So with online learning evolving over the years and all these programs and degrees being available, all of a sudden, people who could not access education before, perhaps due to say time constraints. Maybe they have a full-time job that they have to work on, or family responsibilities. They might be caregivers. They might have dependents, children to take care of. They couldn't go to enroll in an in-person degree, right? Because they simply didn't have the time and maybe resources to do so. But with online education, now they can do all those things on their own terms, on their own time. Online teaching and learning is also great in that it offers flexibility, arguably both for learners and for professors too, right? There is a little bit more of a flexible environment in terms of interactions. For students, for example, they can choose when to go in and watch the videos or complete the assignments based on their own availability, so on and so forth. I think it's also maybe important to mention that there is a debate actually if people have different learning styles or not, but for sure, I think we can say that people might have different learning preferences. So, some people might prefer to watch a video to learn about a concept, or to hear somebody talking about that concept, right? Or to engage in various discussions with other students, right, to get a different opinion and whatnot. And so online learning also pulls in all these different threads and brings them together so that students get a little bit of a well-rounded experience in terms of their learning preferences and understanding of the various topics.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yes, sorry.
I was going to say that, what I've been saying so far, it sounds really positive and great. And it is, right? But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there might be some things that are not necessarily as positive and as great. And one of those things would be, for example, the digital divide, which is still very much a thing in the sense that not everybody has equal access to internet and to various technologies. And so, yes, on one hand, we see an increased access to education, right? But on the other hand, there are still people who cannot access it because they don't have access to the technology they would need it to be successful in the first place. Some people also might prefer the face-to-face interaction with their professors, right? And some people might feel like it's easier to build a relationship with their professor if they go to classes twice a week or once a week, right? And you get to talk to somebody in person as opposed to doing it online. And then, like we were talking before we started to record, sometimes you might encounter technology issues, and you might need to join a call for class, but your internet provider or connection is down for the day, so you can't do that. So, I just wanted to say that there are a lot of pluses, and there are also some things that can be issues sometimes that we might need to be mindful of.
And do teachers and professors themselves have to adapt the way they teach in online environments? I mean, and I'm not talking specifically about, for example, back in 2020 when COVID hit at a certain point. I mean, I noticed this because since I am in regular contact with academics, I had to reschedule a few interviews because people were extremely busy moving materials online and adapting to new technologies like Zoom, for example. But I'm not talking about that adaptation and moving materials online and that kind of thing. I'm talking more about the way they transmit information, the way they teach. Does it change in online environments?
Excellent question. I think it does to some extent, right? So I guess, for example, one thing that comes to mind is that when we teach online, we got to make sure that we design online friendly material for students to engage with, right? And so what does that mean? That means that if we assign, a really long piece of material, audio, video, whatever, to a student to listen or watch, they might or might not do it. I think it depends from a student to another and their preferences, but in general, there is, research out there on how, cognitive overload, and our attention spans are not getting longer but shorter, right? And so with those kinds of things in mind, I think it's important to maybe create shorter, more digestible content for students to engage with, using a variety of multimedia and various online tools that keep students engaged and active with the material. And I think this is particularly important because motivation and showing up every day to do online work is a big factor in the success of online learning, right? And I feel like if students don't have fun, engaging things to come to every single time, then they might not be as motivated to do those things, to come back, to engage, to do well in the course. Let's see, what else? I think that communicating and building community is also really important in online learning. And what I mean by that is, maintaining regular communication with students, creating a sense of presence, of we're here together, we're here to learn, where we can do pretty much a lot of the things that we can do in person, I think, right? Like learn from each other, listen to each other's stories and inputs and insights, right? Grow together, create opportunities for feedback and for discussion. Those kinds of things are really important, I believe, for educators to do in order to create an effective online learning environment.
So I would like to ask you now if we know what predicts the success of e-mentoring. I mean, does it depend, for example, on any specific individual traits of students?
That's a great question. Particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, but even before, there were studies out there looking to understand what exactly the factors or traits of students might be that would predict the success of an e-mentoring relationship. And so I can get to that in a second in terms of my own work, but before I do that, just in general, there are some things in the literature like commitment, students' commitment to mentoring, to their own goals, right, might influence the ways in which they show up and engage in that particular mentoring relationship. Communication is also very, very important. You cannot have a successful mentoring relationship if you're not there to communicate effectively and timely with your mentor, right? And so are clear goals and expectations. So it's really important that everybody, both the mentor and the mentee, really knows what the goals and expectations are so that they're able to build backwards almost from there, right? So the mentor, probably any mentor actually who engages in a mentoring relationship, will initially have a conversation with their mentee where they really get to, the people get to know each other, and the mentor really asks the mentee about their goals and future plans, right? And then with that in mind, the mentor's job for the most part is to kind of like backtrack and see how can they help the mentee get to this distant point or more distant point in time to accomplish their goals. They establish a set of steps maybe that they can work on together so that the mentee can get there. Another thing that we see as important in the literature is cultural and emotional intelligence. So it's important for people to to be able to be aware we're all different people, we all coming from different backgrounds. And so I think it's important to have an awareness and appreciation for that so that we can really, have rich conversations and learn from each other. And then, there's like other more technical the things like the mentor's skills and knowledge. Like you would have to make sure that a mentor, is appropriate, that the pairing, I should say, is appropriate, because not every mentor is going to be good for every mentee and the other way around. People need to have some things in common, right, in order to ensure that they have a mutually beneficial mentoring relationship.
And so in what ways do perceptions that students have of particular aspects of e-mentoring matter here? So, for example, role modeling and psychological and emotional support. And I would imagine when it comes to role modeling, specifically having mentors who are of the same gender, for example. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in my dissertation work, I looked to understand how online students perceive and engage with e-mentoring. And so in doing so, I examined a couple of different factors or traits of students, such as gender, age, digital competence, social self-efficacy, and goal orientation. And I looked specifically at seeing how these things map onto students' perceptions of psychological and emotional support, degree and career support, academic knowledge support, and role modeling that you just mentioned. And so all these things, psychological and emotional support, degree and career support, academic knowledge support, and role modeling, are part of somebody else's research. Her name is Dr. Gloria Crisp, and she created this thing that she calls the College Student Mentoring Scale. That was, I think, first published in about 2009 or so. And so that's a widely used scale in mentoring to try to understand how various traits, again, influence, say, in our case, students' perceptions of all these different areas of e-mentoring, right? And so with role modeling, like you were asking, in my own work, I have to like browse through my brain really quickly. In my own work, I found that when it comes to role modeling in particular, age and gender do not really play any role, right, into it. But digital competence, goal orientation, and social self-efficacy do. So in fact, if I remember correctly, I think social self-efficacy only influenced students' perceptions of role modeling and did not influence their perceptions of psychological and emotional support, degree and career support, and academic knowledge support. And that may be the case because say students who have higher levels of social self-efficacy are maybe more inclined to look up to their mentors, to interact more with them, to want to be more like them, if that makes sense, right? And to be more receptive in that relationship.
And what about future engagement with e-mentoring opportunities? So if people have already engaged with e-mentoring, what predicts if they in the future will do it again? I mean, if they were satisfied enough with the experience and they will want to have it or try it again.
Yeah, so again, in my work, I did not see, contrary to expectations and to what previous research indicates, I did not find that age or gender had any influence on online students' likelihood to engage with future e-mentoring opportunities, be they formal or informal. By the way, we looked at both these things to see whether there would be a difference in terms of formal versus informal e-mentoring programs, and there was not. However, digital competence and goal orientation were the most significant predictors of students' interest to potentially engage in both formal and informal mentoring opportunities in the future. And that's no big surprise, right? When we say digital competence, by the way, we mean just a student's skills to effectively gather information online, engage with all these different technologies, excuse me, and be able to use them effectively, right? And on a side note, because particularly with younger students who have, been growing up through all these technology developments, sometimes in higher education, we tend to assume that these students, who are also known as the digital natives, would be absolutely comfortable with all these tools. And, we assume that they are, say, for example, highly skilled in things like digital competence.
Right.
But sometimes that's not the best assumption to make, because, just because somebody grew up with these tools does not necessarily mean that they know how to use every technology effectively or how to bring them all together and so on and so forth, right? So I think it's important to, just to throw a little caution there and make sure that, maybe we conduct assessments if we have, say, e-mentoring programs, right, to kind of see where the students are at, where the professors are at, because they're no exception either. Sometimes the professors are also assumed to be really digitally competent, and perhaps that's not necessarily the case, since there are so many tools out there and we cannot possibly know every single one of them, right?
Yeah, and also I would imagine that even for the younger people who have been exposed to these newer technologies for a longer period of time, I mean, since new ones are coming around all the time, perhaps we also shouldn't assume that they are familiarized with all of them, because that's, I would imagine, virtually impossible. Right.
Absolutely. Yes. And then remember, we talked about the digital divide a few moments ago. So that's a whole other thing. And, particularly for students coming from rural, that's a hard word to pronounce, rural environments, who did not necessarily not even have access to all these technologies as they were growing up, or the internet connection, right? Yeah. Just assuming that they would be digitally competent would be a huge, huge mistake and lost opportunity in actually, us helping them get to the point where they are comfortable using all these tools successfully.
So I think we've been sort of alluding to this throughout the interview, but just perhaps to sum things up a little bit, what would you say are some of the advantages and disadvantages of e-mentoring compared to some more traditional forms of mentoring?
That is an excellent question. And one of my favorites when I talk about e-mentoring, actually. So yeah, we alluded to these things a little bit, but I think, in terms of advantages, one of the biggest advantages, I think, from e-mentoring affording this really huge geographic flexibility. So with traditional mentoring relationships, oftentimes people would be location bound, right? You had to be at the same school, you had to be at the same company, you had to be in the same location. But with e-mentoring, virtually, you can, reach as far as you want, right? and find the people you would want to connect with, no matter where they are in the world, and reach out to them and, you know, kind of see what happens, right? So that's huge, and that's also really, really important because it brings up new opportunities for people who maybe would not have had such opportunities before. So, for example, again, going back to online students, for example, who, you know, maybe are full-time workers and parents and all these things, it's unlikely that they could have, you know, had in-person mentors. But again, with e-mentoring now, they can engage with people and build these connections, which can come with really, really great benefits. So, you know, for example, for women and people who are coming from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, e-mentoring is really, really important because it can help them, you know, be more connected, have a broader network, which will maybe lead to more opportunities. It can shape their interest in graduate school and various careers that they would not maybe have thought of otherwise, because, you know, somebody like me does not necessarily go there because I did not have a role model, right? And I didn't know that that's possible for me. So we see that we have countless examples throughout the e-mentoring programs that I'm involved with, for example. Then another big advantage, I think, comes from the flexibility, kind of hinted to this already, from the flexibility that people have. You know, we can work around our schedules, we can find a time that works for everybody, right? And we can make this relationship happen. Maybe it's also important to mention that with e-mentoring, we can keep track of conversations, maybe document conversations, right? So if our meeting today, say, was an e-mentoring meeting, then we could record it and you know, say, me as the mentee, I could then go and look at the recording transcript on my own later on if I wanted to reference something, to remember something, you know, to go do some research on some resources, maybe reference, so on and so forth, right? So it would be easier from that point of view too. Then in terms of disadvantages, like I mentioned before, some people might feel a lack of personal connection with e-mentoring because, you know, for various reasons. Some people might prefer to meet in person. Some people might feel like it's more difficult to really build genuine relationships online, right? And they might really be feeling like they miss on those personal interactions. Technical difficulties, right? We mentioned that already. Those can happen too, and they're no fun. There could be some privacy concerns in terms of, you know, data sharing and stuff with various software recording, you know, people's email addresses and phone numbers and whatnot. But, you know, I would argue that these are no different than, you know, the information that's being collected when you sign up for, you know, a new grocery store newsletter or whatever, right? Something that you would do maybe anyways. And then I guess sometimes there can be a little bit of a disconnection in terms of delayed responses. So if we communicate via email, for example, you know, the conversation does not quite happen in real time. There is a little bit of a delay between what I send, what I receive, you know, and maybe that's problematic for some people. But again, for me personally, I feel like these things can be easily, or somewhat at least easily addressed. And I think that the advantages are far, far beyond the disadvantages for e-mentoring.
By the way, earlier you've mentioned COVID-19. So what impact did the pandemic have on e-mentoring and how it is studied?
It had a great impact, like it did on online education, really, but with e-mentoring too. I started my doctoral program in May of 2020, when when the pandemic was very much a thing, right? And I finished my doctoral program throughout the pandemic, and I think I only went to school in person maybe like 3 times.
Oh my God.
Otherwise, all of my classes are online, all of my meetings with my colleagues, with my advisors, everything. And it was great. I loved it. It worked really well for me. But at the same time, I had decided that I really early on in 2020 that I will focus my dissertation on e-mentoring. So I kept a really close eye on how the field was developing, right? And so I've seen a lot of great papers come out throughout the pandemic. And many of them really focused on understanding how the pandemic is impacting students and e-mentoring. Are students more likely to engage in e-mentoring than they would have been before? Absolutely, yes. Are they drawing benefits from being engaged in e-mentoring during the pandemic? Absolutely, yes, again. And so some of those benefits would be things like, there has been papers who were authors who have found that students who are engaged in e-mentoring relationships during the pandemic reported significantly less anxiety and depression, for example, compared to people who were not engaged in e-mentoring, and overall just better mental health. They felt they indicated that they felt higher rates of belonging and inclusiveness, which is really important, particularly during the pandemic when, everybody's world was kind of shattered and rearranged in some way, right? And just like before the pandemic, pretty much, the results were consistent, showing that students who were engaged in e-mentoring had overall better grades, better GPAs, better access to various network opportunities, a larger social capital, so they knew more people that they could go to when they needed help, so on and so forth. So yes, the pandemic really influenced how much people were actually focusing on e-mentoring, both as a practice and as a field of study.
So do you think that the work you and other people are doing on e-mentoring, how it works, when it works, with whom it works, etc., can help mentors and educators design e-mentoring opportunities?
I certainly hope so. Yeah, I surely hope so. So, one of the big, I think from my perspective, there is like 2 main messages that I would put out there, right? One has to do with digital competence and its importance for e-mentoring and more broadly for online learning. I think it's really, really important to run assessments of digital competence, both for students and for teachers and professors, and to really develop training modules and various other, provide various other support opportunities for them to help them develop this skill further and further. And I think that there is not going to be a point where we're going to say, oh, okay, you have a lot of digital competence and you can stop. I don't think we're going to get there because technology advances, like we said, so at such a fast rate, right, these days, that we have to keep learning and we have to keep improving our skills in order to be effective teachers and learners and mentors and e-mentors and so on and so forth. And another thing I want to mention from my personal experience as the co-founder and co-director of the ACE Scholars Program and the Cooperation Scholars Program and all the other mentoring programs we're running at ASU is that I think community is really, really important when it comes to e-mentoring. So building community and nurturing community with students is going to be crucial for the success of any e-mentoring opportunity. And what I mean by community is really nothing fancy, right? What I mean is just creating this welcoming environment where students know that they are appreciated for who they are, where we treat students from what we call in higher education an asset-based perspective rather than a deficit perspective. So in a deficit perspective, we say, oh, students are not good at math, and therefore we're going to do this to fix it. Whereas in an asset perspective, we say, oh, they're great at multiplication. This is a silly example, right? So we're going to focus on that and building the skills that they're good at to kind of like help build everything and carry it on, right? So in our own experience, we find that when we encourage students to bring their whole selves to school, right, in this case, and to work too, I would argue, and just create this environment where it's warm and welcoming and really appreciating of everybody's backgrounds and interests, then people are more likely to engage. They start to share various stories and experiences. They realize that they're more alike than not, right? And this really great thing happens where everybody learns from each other and we grow together as a community of scholars in this particular example.
So that's about e-mentoring. I have one last question / topic I would like to explore here. So I know you're also interested in barriers to student success. So what have you studied in that regard, and which do you think are some of the biggest barriers here?
That's an excellent question. And an unfortunate topic that we have to be aware of in higher education, I think. Yeah. It was quite a few years ago, maybe during my master's program, so quite a few years ago, when I learned about this thing called basic needs insecurity. Right. And basic needs insecurity is an umbrella term that basically is composed of or refers to food insecurity, housing insecurity, and things of that nature, right, that students could experience that will most definitely prevent them from being successful in their educational endeavors, right? There have been quite a few researchers over the years who have looked at these things. There is this big group that's based out of the Temple University now. It's called the Hope Center. And they do a lot of work on basic needs and security. And, they try to survey nationally representative samples across the United States. And for the past few years, they have consistently found that as much as 45% of the undergraduate student population experienced some sort of food insecurity at some point during their college experience. And that's a huge problem because you cannot learn and you cannot be successful in school when you are hungry, right? And when you don't know where your next meal might be coming from. In the same line of work, they also looked at students who are experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness, and they define these things. They put them into two different categories, I think. So housing insecurity is when people have temporary issues with housing. So they might, go crash on somebody's couch for 2 weeks. That would be housing insecurity. Or they have, 8 roommates within 2 bedrooms. That's also not ideal, right? And homelessness, it's quite obvious, you just don't have a place to live. For housing insecurity, again, a huge proportion of students, up to 20% or so, if I remember correctly, reported having experienced that at times, and about 10% or so of students reported experiencing homelessness at times while being in school. So those are obviously really great issues that students are dealing with. And if the basic needs are not covered, then people just cannot be successful, period, in school, work, or otherwise. And so over the years, we've seen an increase of universities and colleges across the country really, working to start to address these issues. So, for example, universities have built and are supporting having pantries on campus where students can go pick up some food every now and then, and just, more in general, maybe connect students with various resources that they need. From here on, in general, I would go and say that there is, just broadly speaking, a bunch of financial constraints that students could experience that could really impact their success in higher education. So, with that, again, we know that an unexpected expense of $500, no more, no less, right? I mean, maybe less, maybe more. But just in average, something like $500 that comes out of nowhere that a student needs to cover for a car repair, say, or something like that, can really derail their education, because they might not be able to cover tuition. And if you did not pay your full tuition by the end of the semester, you will not be able to enroll in classes for the next semester. Now you have a hold on your account, then you have some more fees added on top of that, right? And things can snowball really quickly. And so with that, universities have started to create these emergency funds, they call them, where students can apply for financial aid to cover an emergency that they had. And those are, great initiatives to help students succeed. And probably we could do even better in terms of being more responsive and helping students more timely with these kinds of things, and having really streamlined processes so that when a student applies to something like an emergency financial aid type thing, they don't have to wait a week or 2 weeks to receive the money. They need it right then and there, right? So a process that could go faster would probably be a little bit more ideal.
And do you think, and this will be my last question, then, do you think that the trends when it comes to some of these barriers you mentioned to success in university and elsewhere, do you think that trends here are positive or not?
I think they're positive, and at the same time, I think that there is a long way to go too, right? Again, going back to the basic needs and security example, we definitely have seen lots of changes only over the past 5 years or so, with various programs in place, universities really being more aware of this really being an issue, right? But before, like 10 years ago, I don't know if we even knew that that's a problem. Probably not. Right. So now we know that that's a problem, and we work to address it, and that's great. So the trends are positive. And at the same time, now that we tackled this big thing, maybe we kind of have to wonder, what are other things that might be out there that prevent students from being successful, and see how we can help address them.
Great. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website where I try to centralize a lot of my work. That is CristinaBaciu.org. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I should say that I'm really more than happy to connect and talk to people. I love just, having conversations, exchanging ideas, and see where that takes us.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was really good to talk to you.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Perurga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Dugny, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.